I want to talk about Sergeant First Class Paul Ray Smith, Medal of Honor winner from Bravo Company, 11th Engineer Battalion, 3rd United States Infantry Division. He won his in the initial invasion of Iraq in April of 2003. I knew him and his family as his company commander, Bravo Company, 11th Engineer Battalion. We met at Fort Stewart, Georgia. I took over the company in January 2001, and like a lot of commanders, you kind of assess your key leaders and how they do their job. They do the job well. How are things going with the unit? And one thing I learned about Sergeant First Class Paul Smith was that he was a new platoon sergeant at the time, an E6, a staff sergeant. And they'd given him the most complicated platoon that a combat engineer company's got, which is the assault and obstacle company platoon. That's full of equipment, but not real full of men. So each guy's got about 2 or 3 pieces of equipment he's got to ride herd on, and it's a tough platoon to be the platoon sergeant of. But they'd given it to this new staff sergeant as his new platoon. And I thought that was interesting, just looking at it from the company commander spot, because I was new as well. But I quickly learned that Sergeant First Class Smith was all about the standards of performance of duty. And so he read up on all the equipment that was in that platoon. He learned as much as he could about it, and he trained his guys from dawn to dusk on that equipment and on their mission. And then we learned we were going to go to Kosovo in the summer of 2001. And so he trained them up on the mission that we were going to receive in Kosovo, which was to fight as infantry. So not only had he trained them on all the engineer tasks of running heavy equipment, he was also going to train them up on how to be infantrymen and patrol dismounted and mounted in Kosovo. And so he did that too. And I quickly learned what it meant to train guys to standard and not to time, as I would start to get a lot of phone calls from family about their soldiers not making it home at the end of the duty day, which most people thought would be 1700. My brigade commander had me on speed dial for Sergeant First Class Paul Smith. Next slide. Because he would train his guys so late into the night that that my brigade commander and even the CG's office would start calling me about this man. But to his testament, he wouldn't lead his guys into combat untrained. That was not going to happen on his watch. And so that was kind of his mantra. We talked about these Americans being every bit as selfless and dedicated as any that had gone before, and that's kind of our theme here. And what I've learned as I read about Sergeant First Class Paul Smith and put what I've been reading about him and his Medal of Honor with what I knew about him as a man, and then as I read more Medal of Honor citations, as I've met some of these national treasures, like the men of the Idrong Valley, 1st and 7th Cav, the 13 outside, you can see them signing their books. They're just national treasures. And I think Sergeant First Class Paul Smith is one of those national treasures. Slide. What you'll see on the next slide is just some biographical data. That's kind of just the science of who history says Sergeant First Class Paul Smith was. I knew him as a really energetic guy that couldn't sit still. He always wanted to be making it happen. He didn't like PowerPoint. He didn't like a lot of paperwork. He liked to be out with his men training. And he liked to do it every day he came to work. He would teach them lessons. The biggest things he wanted to teach them was offense, defense, patrolling mounted, demolitions. His favorite weapon was the 50 cal. He loved the 50 cal, and he trained all his guys on how to run that gun so they could do it with muscle memory. And you'll see in his Medal of Honor citation that was key in some things that he had to do there in the end. Slide. How he won his Medal of Honor, I'm going to go through this really quickly. Basically, the division put in a river crossing at Objective Peach across the Euphrates River, about 27 miles south of Baghdad, southwest of Baghdad. his brigade that he was in held that objective through the night and then attacked on into the airport the next morning. They didn't get any sleep all through here. This is all canals and rivers, and you just about have to ground guide your vehicles through there. He ground guided his platoon onto this objective. Slide. And didn't get any sleep. Next slide. And the airport itself, to secure it, the brigade that took it over tasked his company to move with a different infantry battalion called Task Force 27 Infantry. And they were going to secure this east side from the city. And he was part of this blocking position just to the east side of the airport. Slide. You can see it listed here. What you see here is a big long tunnel that goes from one side of the support infrastructure of the airport, goes from one side to the other across the main highway. Slide. And he was on astride the highway as a blocking position. And there's a big concrete wall that runs the perimeter of the airport that as he was securing this area with the Battalion 48 station, the Battalion TOCs right over here, the command post for the battalion is just over here. His platoon, his engineer platoon was out here, conducted some operations, and they'd caught some enemy prisoners of war. Slide. And so he was tasked to make an enemy prisoner of war holding area. Slide. And so he knocked down this part of the wall. You go to the next slide. With some of his engineer equipment and starts to make this his holding compound. But as they start to develop the situation, they find that that area had not been cleared of enemy. Slide. He puts two of his sentries to the north and a little bit to the west of the cantonment area that he was going to put his enemy prisoners of war in, and they start to send him reports. Slide. What they start to see is some enemy soldiers with small arms and mortars moving up on that enemy prisoner of war holding area and up on the engineer platoon. Slide. And so Sergeant Smith starts to develop the situation further and deploy his men. And I talked about there's a point at each of these stories where you'll see the Medal of Honor winner start to take some tactical read of the situation and recognize all the ramifications of what he's seeing. This, what some folks now call recognition prime decision making, is what these guys do. They've seen it enough and trained at it enough that they know what needs to happen next. And he starts to deploy his men to make that happen. Slide. He brings in his armored personnel carriers and starts to try to get them through the wall. Slide. But the enemy that's deployed starts to cut that platoon off from him, and so he brings up another armored carrier, this one's a Bradley, to engage while he can deploy the rest of his forces. Slide. As these guys are getting uncoiled to start moving up, the enemy moves into a pillbox and takes that position, that high terrain position, to start to engage the rest of his column and start to defeat some of Sergeant First Class Smith's vehicles with RPGs. Slide. He's still to the west deploying the vehicles that he's been able to get forward to start engaging about a company size worth of enemy forces. Slide. They're being engaged with mortars, RPGs, and small arms and machine gun fire. Slide. And so Sergeant First Class Smith, as that initial position gets overrun, he runs back, brings in a 113, which is an armed personnel carrier with a 50 cal on top, and makes his last stand. That's his final protective fire right there. And he knows that there's nothing between him, that forward aid station, and the battalion command post, except that track and the other tracks over here that are already burning from being engaged by the enemy. He saw what needed to be done, and he did it. He stayed on this gun position through 3 reloads. His sappy plate had 27 rounds in it when they retrieved his body, but he stayed there until he broke the attack. People will say that's uncommon valor. What I know of those men and what I've read about the Medal of Honor citations about the ones that are coming with me on this panel and their Medal of Honor winners, it was a common